Here's a question I get asked quite frequently, and usually it's someone gets an appraisal done and they're disappointed with the value, and they're disappointed because it came in lower than they were expecting. And I'm going to explain to you why that happens and what it actually means. So the first thing is, imagine you have a house that's worth $300,000, or at least you think it's worth $300,000, and you need to get an appraisal done, and the appraisal comes in at $275,000. So you say, hey, how come my appraisal is so low? And I'll explain to you how appraisals work. So there's two different methods appraisers use. The first method is the comparison method. So they basically compare what has sold in your neighborhood, and they make some adjustments. And then the second is the cost approach. And the cost approach is not actually used very often unless someone's doing construction. So I'm not going to get into that one today, but I'll explain the comparison approach. So let's assume you have a 2,100 square foot house, and your appraisal came in at 275, or even let's say it was even worse. Let's say it came in at 250. So it was a very disappointing appraisal. And here's how they may have come up with that number. So if you have a street of houses and you have a bunch of people on that street who own these nice little houses, what the appraiser does is he goes into your house, figures out, or she does, they go in and figure out how big your house is, they look at the finishings, the quality, and then they go out and they look for sales in your area or your neighborhood when possible. Sometimes they can't find anything in your neighborhood, which can make it difficult, but if they can, then they try to find stuff that's close. So let's assume that in your neighborhood, so this is your house here, and it appraised at $250, and when the appraiser went out and looked, he saw that this house sold a little while ago for $230. Maybe it wasn't quite as nice as yours. And then this house sold for, and it was a little bit smaller, this one sold for $210, and maybe this one sold for $250. It was a similar house. So the appraiser will make adjustments. They'll get those comparable sales, and they'll make adjustments based on, okay, you have more square footage, you have an extra bathroom, whatever the criteria. They will eventually come out to a number that basically is an average based on your market. And the problem is, though, is that let's say that this fellow over here, you don't know what his financial situation's like. Maybe he owns 4 or 5 houses, and this one he has to sell. He fire sales his house for $200,000 because he needs to get out, and this becomes a comparable. So it basically will lower the average price for everybody in the neighborhood because somebody had to sell their house. Now, that doesn't mean that your house is only worth $250,000. It may be that that's the average today, but if you don't sell it, it's sort of irrelevant. So most often when somebody gets an appraisal they're disappointed with, it's because the comparables are not strong. And typically lenders don't want, the other thing is they don't want comparables that are usually older than 90 days if possible. Because the market's changed quite a bit and does change, if you may be able to find, let's say this house sold for $300, but it was 8 months ago, that is not going to be a strong comparable because they're going to say, well, I know 8 months ago the market was one way, today it's this way, so they try to find the most current sales that they can find. So if you're disappointed with your appraisal, it probably has more to do with the comparables and what the other people's financial situation in your neighborhood, and if they've had to dump their house. So if you're in real estate for the long term, which is what I recommend, then an appraisal today that comes in at $250 doesn't really matter because over the long term, real estate will eventually go up again, and it'll even out. And just to give you an idea, the cost approach. So the way the cost approach works is, if let's say somebody's building a house, the appraiser will look at the lot price. They'll look at the cost of construction on average. And then they will come up with what your house should be worth based on these numbers. So if your lot was 100 and your construction was 200, then they would say, okay, based on the cost approach, it would take, in the current market, it would cost $300,000 to build this house. They can do the same thing with this. Maybe your comparative approach is 250, but the cost approach may actually be higher or lower depending on what the cost of land and construction is in your neighborhood. Most lenders don't use this for a whole lot except for construction. If you have questions on real estate or mortgages, please send me an email to scott@scottpeckford.ca.